On October 7th, Israel suffered a brutal attack as Hamas militants from Gaza rampaged across southern Israel, massacring up to 1,500 Jews and taking 200 more captive. Israel's response has been to unleash a massive bombing campaign on the Gaza Strip, home to 2 million people who have nowhere to go. As of this recording, the bombardment of Gaza continues, with thousands dead and up to 1 million people displaced in what has become a complete humanitarian catastrophe. To get perspective on what is going on, yesterday I spoke to Dalia Hatuqa, a journalist based out of the West Bank, which Israel has been occupying along with Gaza since 1967. Dalia is a journalist specializing in Israeli-Palestinian affairs and has long covered the conflict. We spoke about what the perspective is like from the West Bank, what is unfolding in Gaza, and the impact of the near 60-year occupation, as well as prospects for peace between the Israelis and Palestinians. As always, hit like, subscribe, and leave a review to help grow the show. Enjoy. Can just kind of briefly open up with talking a bit about yourself and the kind of work that you do.
Uh, my name is Dalia Hatuqa. I've been covering Israel-Palestine for close to 20 years now. Most of the work that I do is mostly is out of the West Bank. I'm not allowed to go into Gaza, so I haven't really been able to cover that area much. I just cover it remotely. And yeah, that's pretty much it.
Great. Well, thank you for being on. And I do want to get into what life is like in the West Bank, but first, just wanted to see what you're hearing from Gaza, anything that you've been able to get out of that. I know it's been a tight blockade, electricity, food, water, but have you been able to kind of get anything out of what's going on in the ground there?
Honestly, like what's happening is just like a horrifying like sequence of events that we in the West Bank seem to be watching in slow motion almost, because physically, like we're I mean geographically we're far apart from one another, and also the fact that we're not, Palestinians from the West Bank mostly aren't allowed to go into Gaza, and vice versa. So it feels like we're a bit, like we're on another planet. But honestly, like if you look at the West Bank and how people are seeing things, we're just eyeing things with a lot of sadness. But sorry, to go back to your question, yeah, in the Gaza Strip, basically people are suffering. As you may well know, there's the bombardment has left people without shelter, without food. The Gaza Strip has already been reeling from high unemployment, high poverty rates, drinking water that's not safe for human consumption, and all these things. So you can imagine the situation right now where water has been cut off. And I know there's been reports that some of the water has been restored to southern Gaza, but according to the UN, that's not really the case. So most of what we're hearing, as far as also on a personal level, a lot of friends in the West Bank have family in Gaza, and a lot of them have been killed, many of them children. The situation is really bleak. Yeah.
For a lot of Americans, they don't have a clear grasp of the full picture. I know you've worked out of DC, so I'm sure you've seen just how the American media covers the conflict. What would you say to Americans who just kind of woke up to the attack by Hamas last weekend and just sort of view the conflict through that prism, that Israel was attacked brutally? I think they say it's the worst day since the Holocaust, just gruesome details about what happened. And now they see Israel as defending itself, as they think any nation would do. How would you explain this conflict to Americans who want to understand what's happening on the ground?
Look, it's really difficult to explain things. I know that's not what people want to hear. It's difficult to explain things because it's hard to get people to feel things, especially when they've kind of been accustomed to a certain feeling towards like Arabs, Muslims, Palestinians. It's really hard to change people's minds. That's not what I'm here to do. But I think what's important to be said is that long before this attack on Israel, the Gaza Strip has been under siege for over 16 years. And by siege, I mean people can't go anywhere. They can't leave to get medical help. They can't leave for educational purposes. They can't see their family. I know, friends who didn't see their family for maybe 10, 12 years. And then in the meantime, you've got this pressure cooker with all these people in, this heavily densely populated area that have nowhere to go. What I'm trying to say is that I'm not trying to make excuses. I'm trying to explain the situation or the context of why things happen or the context behind things happening. And for years, people have just been sitting there in the Gaza Strip with no hope, lots of desperation. And then on top of that, in the lead up to this moment, there's been a lot of things that have been happening in the West Bank as well. Things related to the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound or, Temple Mount. And the fact is that settler violence in the West Bank has also been on the rise. So it's not just like one thing that leads to another. It's a series of things. And I think that the Gaza Strip is really in a situation right now where I don't think Israel is defending itself. You defend yourself by fighting back. You don't defend yourself by killing more innocent people. And this is what's happening to people on the ground. Basically, people are being told to seek shelter. They in the Gaza Strip, they go where they're told and they're bombed. And I don't think that that's defending yourself. Ultimately, you can't defend yourself after the fact. What you're doing is you're just killing people, like lots and lots of children. We're talking about 60% of the people who have been killed in Gaza are mainly, and this is a low estimate, but are mainly women and children. Honestly, I can't bear the thought of anybody dying. Like, I can't bear the thought of whoever, like the horrific images that came out of Israel and the horrific images that are coming out of Gaza are just like a little too much, for anybody to bear. And I think there is a solution out of it. I think right now Netanyahu is kind of in a bind, and I'm sorry I'm taking us on this like other topic, and we can stop here if you want to kind of guide this discussion.
No, I think that's great. I did just want to set context for people to kind of understand the background, and I'm sure I'll leave stuff out, so please feel free to fill in the gaps. But just going back to the founding of Israel in 1948, that is when Israel fought a war with its Arab neighbors and wound up taking quite a bit of land from what had been the Palestinian part of the UN partition, drove off 750,000 Palestinians from their homes in what's referred to as the Nakba, or the catastrophe. Many of those refugees winding up in the West Bank and Gaza. Then other just quick key moments in 1967 is when Israel came in control of the Gaza and the West Bank, in addition to Sinai and Golan Heights, but began really the almost now 60-year occupation of both the West Bank and Gaza. And in the West Bank in particular, you had mentioned settlers. Israel began almost immediately after the 67 war to build up settlements, were effectively colonies in the West Bank, and some in Gaza as well. But in 2005, Israel withdrew its settlers from Gaza, A lot of people have said that it ended its occupation in Gaza, but I don't think that's internationally recognized as an end to the occupation. As you pointed out, since then, they, with the US's help, instituted a blockade around Gaza. And I should say with Egypt's help as well on the Rafah border crossing. And in Gaza, they've been living in basically destitution ever since. 90% of Gazans don't have access, and this is before the conflict, access to clean water, 60% unemployment, majority of the population on food aid. So just a devastating situation. But I know you're based now out of Ramallah on the West Bank, and you had mentioned increased settler violence. I wanted to sort of start off, if you could talk about what life is like on the West Bank. I'm not sure a lot of people understand what it's like with all the settlements that are sort of dotted throughout the West Bank and then connected with Israeli Jewish only roads, and there's checkpoints, and then, as you mentioned, settler violence. Can you just kind of paint the picture of what day-to-day life is like for a Palestinian on the West Bank?
It depends where you are. I mean, I live in Ramallah where, and in the city itself, and not like the towns and villages, that are in the vicinity. So I kind of, as a human being, I'm sheltered, but like as a journalist, obviously I know more about what's going on because I talk to people and whatnot. But if you go to Hebron, for example, in the West Bank, like Hebron is effectively, it's a town that's basically split. There's a settlement like in the heart of Hebron, and so people live. So, you can say they live in cages sometimes because like what Palestinians have done is they've had to insulate themselves inside their homes, like by putting like barbed wire and things of that sort like outside their homes, because they get attacked regularly. They get Molotov cocktails or like bottles of urine thrown at them. There's also like a system
And
of
this is from the
segregation.
settlers?
This is from the settlers, and there's a system of segregation that's imposed by the Israeli military, so that if you go to Hebron and let's say you and I go there, they'll tell me to walk on one road, they'll tell you to walk on another road, and they have no problems, with that. They don't see an issue with that. Whereas like if this were to happen in the United States, for example, that would be a huge problem. This is me kind of like giving you an example rather than explaining. So maybe I'll go into the explanation, which is, the West Bank, many cities like Hebron, Tulkarem, Jenin, especially, and Nablus, they, they have to fight to stay on their land. The people there, they have to ward off a lot of settler violence, especially in the Nablus area. I was talking to this man the other day, and he was telling me that, it was in a village next to Nablus, and he was telling me that he had to ward off like all these armed settlers that came in, like one time into his village, and they tried to attack this house, and 4 people were killed. 4 Palestinians were killed, I should say. And then the next day, this man that I was talking to and his son went to the funeral procession. And again, the funeral was attacked by armed settlers, and the man and his son were killed. So it's like one day I was talking to this guy, and then the next day he's gone. And these are the kind of things that happen like on a daily basis, but people don't talk about them. And this is what sometimes like people who don't live in the West Bank or who aren't following what's going on, perceive as relative quiet. Like you hear people saying, "Oh, but it's kind of quiet now, in the West Bank," and it's like, but is it really, And that's the kind of quiet that we have. The quiet is actually not so. It's basically Palestinians living in fear of going around, because the settlements, they are among us. They're like on the hilltops, so to speak. And so, but you're constantly in fear of your, for your life. And especially people whose land like gets confiscated, whose homes get attacked. There was really particularly bad incident a few months back where some homes, I believe in Huwara in Nablus, were attacked and they were torched. And, even the Israeli military like called it, a pogrom. And so these things happen almost on a daily basis, and that's the kind of life that you lead. It's a life of fear.
And what happens to the settlers when they attack Palestinians? Are there recriminations from the Israeli government?
Hardly. I mean, if you look at the statistics, and I don't have those like right in front of me, but maybe there's like, I don't know, less than 1% of I would say both soldiers and settlers who have killed Palestinians who have been, prosecuted or taken to prison and whatnot. Like usually people just get like a slap on the hand. There is no system. I mean, you can't have like a system that will give you justice if that system is the very system that's oppressing you. And so you can't be under the military rule of Israel and then expect Israel to kind of save you, or even though that's what international law says, as an occupying force you have these responsibilities, but that's not the case. And a lot of the times these attacks happen under with the Israeli soldiers nearby, or they're watching and not really doing anything.
And so for a lot of people trying to understand why the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as it's called, persists, I think it's important to underscore there had been this idea of what was called a two-state solution, where there would be a Palestinian state in Gaza and the West Bank. But Israel has continued to expand into the West Bank, building up these settlements. It's not a static activity. It's one of constant growth. Again, to the point where it's 600,000 to 700,000 settlers in the West Bank right now, almost going all the way entirely around Jerusalem. Do you see any viability for a two-state solution at this point, given the continued buildup in the West Bank?
I mean, I haven't seen a viability for the two-state solution in years, and that question, I mean, and this is no way like, me trying to say anything about you, but that question is particularly very like DC, a question that comes out of DC, because people on the ground know that there is no two-state solution. Like we've known this, both Israelis and Palestinians, but for different reasons. For Palestinians, it's because of the settlements, it's because of the blockade on Gaza, the attacks on, the attempts to also like remove people from their homes in occupied East Jerusalem. And Israelis also say, no to a two-state solution because ultimately they don't want to give up the land. I mean, just to put it in like very simple terms. And so yeah, I don't see that there's any solution in that realm. Like I don't see a Palestine-Israel happening. Maybe I'm like among the few that see the only solution being, and I know you didn't ask me this, but I just don't see any kind of solution except perhaps the one that involves Palestinians and Israelis sharing the land.
Yeah, Peter Beinart has proposed a few years ago one-state solution where there's protections for all groups under a kind of multi-ethnic democracy. But a lot of people have said the big problem with that is Israel's desire to be a Jewish state. And if the demographics are not in their favor, as it's been framed, then they'll cease to be a Jewish state, even if they still remain in democracy.
Yeah, I don't think you can be Jewish and democratic. You can't be just ethnically like specific and
As a
democratic.
state, you're
You,
saying.
yeah,
As a
like,
country, yeah.
yes, sorry, not as a human being. You can be whatever you want, but you can't take away from the rights of other people and then pretend that you're a democracy. Because right now, what's happening in Israel proves to us that Israel is not a democracy, like far from it. And the fact that also we haven't even talked about Palestinians inside Israel and how they're treated as second rate citizens. And that's another reason why Israel shouldn't be, viewed as a democracy. I mean, yes, Israel does have, rights that a lot of Middle Eastern countries don't have, LGBTQ plus rights. But again, they only apply to certain, people. And I don't think that Israel is on this path where it's, as a country, where it's looking kind of inwards to see where it can or how it can resolve the conflict. Because what's been happening is that the conflict has been managed for so long, and Israel assumes that by managing the conflict through a security lens, then you can kind of ensure that Palestinians are kept at bay, they're silent and whatnot. But over and over, with the number of wars that have been waged and with the invasions and raids and the high number of detainees and whatnot, like you can kind of paint a picture and you can see for yourself that you cannot maintain an occupation and then expect yourself to maintain your own security as well. It's just not going to happen. Like people are ultimately gonna rise against it, and that's what's been happening, every few years, and in Gaza especially, but also in the West Bank.
What are your views on Mahmoud Abbas? He's the president of the PLO, right?
He's the president of the PLO, but he's also the president of the Palestinian
The
Authority and
Palestinian
Fatah,
Authority.
which is the governing party of the Palestinian Authority. So he's kind of like a lot of things, but he kind of put himself in that situation. I mean, okay, so in 2005, he was elected to be president of the Palestinian Authority after the death of Yasser Arafat. But it's been over, I can't do the math right now, but like it's been almost close to 2 decades of him, being the PA president, and there's been no elections. Every time we've come close to having elections, he's come up with situations or excuses not to hold the elections, because I mean ultimately he's afraid that Hamas would win, which is something that happened, which is what happened in the Gaza Strip and ultimately led to the siege or the blockade in 2007. So to answer your question, I guess, I mean, my thoughts on him is that he's irrelevant. He's out of touch. He's surrounded by a bunch of yes men who don't tell him, who don't like have their finger on the pulse of the street, and who don't tell him what needs to be done. And the fact that he came out with all these statements, after Hamas attacked Israel, a lot of people think that he's more out of touch than they even thought, because he came out and he's like, Hamas does not represent the Palestinian people, which is essentially true. I mean, no one faction like represents the Palestinian people. We're, not like a homogenous, entity, but at the end of the day, like, he cannot speak for the people, whatever it is. And I think the fact that Biden is coming tomorrow and meeting with him is laughable. It's like it's like meeting my pet turtle or something. Like, what's the point of this, you know? And and all these statements coming out, you know, by Blinken and other US administration people just saying, "Oh yeah, we just talked to Abbas." I'm like, "Why? Why are you talking to him? He can't do anything." I mean, uh, you know, he's kind of like he's barely in control of his own movements. I mean, the fact that like he leaves the West Bank to Jordan via a Jordanian helicopter, he has to get Israeli approval for all his movements. He's technically like a piece on a chessboard that's being moved around. So a lot of people want him gone. Like if you look at the polls, like for years now, more than 50% of the Palestinian people are saying that he has to step down, which he's not going to do, obviously. But yeah, I think he's out of touch, and I don't think he's relevant in this case. Like even when you look at like how he reacted to you know the attack on Israel and then the attack on Gaza subsequently, it took him, I don't know, maybe 2 days or something to issue a statement. He never comes out and talks to people. He not that that would be something that, you know, would give him more street cred or something, but he's just not in touch with the people, you know, at all.
Yeah, and I've seen him portrayed in some of the media that I've read as almost a sort of like collaborator in like a neo-colonial approach, kind of like how the the British ruled India with Indian troops and Indian collaborators, and the Nazis ruled France with the help of the French. It was never, or it wasn't always just direct rule. And that I've seen both Yasser Arafat and Mahmoud Abbas portrayed in that kind of lens as basically collaborators with the occupational force, the Israelis. Maybe not 100% on the same page, but just kind of corrupt and easily influenced or under the control of the Israelis and the Americans. Do you think that's a fair perspective?
I mean, I don't know about Arafat because ultimately he died while he went against what the Israelis wanted, you know, like he was under siege for, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 years. I can't remember now. But there was obviously a lot of corruption. There was, you know, there was some talk about him. I don't remember it being like this, but I mean, I don't want to compare the two because, like, you know, Arafat has the legacy related to, like, you know, establishing Fatah and you know, his work with the PLO and whatnot. And Abbas is more like he's always been more into peace negotiations, and his legacy, so to speak, would be that he always insisted on nonviolent resistance, which is interesting in the case of Palestine and Israel, because, like, you know, for years people would come out, especially like in villages around Ramallah. Like this is a few years ago, and they would do peaceful demonstrations and whatnot, and just, you know, carry flags, and they'd be shot by live ammunition. There's like so many stories that honestly, like, I can't even remember what they are right now, but so many stories of people who were killed like that. And then you had the demonstrations that Palestinians in Gaza held a few years back as well. And they were at the periphery, or like, let's say, at the fence that separates Gaza from Israel, and they would just, you know, be sniped, or, you know, killed by snipers, or shot in the legs, in the eyes, whatnot. And the fact that they were doing this, you know, for so long and doing it peacefully, and it just didn't give any results, it made people think twice about wanting to be a part of that. Again, this is not like an excuse, you know, or whatever, but this is the context, is that for a lot of people, nonviolent resistance is something that they don't see as being effective.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to make, because you do see a lot of criticism in the Western media is saying, why don't the Palestinians ever have a Martin Luther King or a Gandhi, any kind of nonviolent resistance movement? And what doesn't get reported is that there has been quite a lot of that. And you've had nonviolent leaders who have been arrested and taken away by the Israelis. And you, as you pointed out, nonviolent protesters who have been shot at and harmed by the IDF with almost no coverage in the Western media. So it's not as if that option, that, as you pointed out, doesn't justify violence. But for people wondering where the nonviolent resistance has been, it's been there almost the entire time. And yet it has not affected anything because it's been suppressed.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like I said, all these protests day in and day out, I remember they used to happen every Friday, and whole families, whole families would be killed. I think one particular family like stood out amidst all of this, and there was a book written about this girl. Her name, God, what was her name? The name escapes me, but the family was like really renowned for being, one of the leaders in the nonviolent resistance. And they had so many people from their family being killed. The girl herself, who was part of this family, also went to jail, an Israeli jail, for a long time. Her name's Ahad Tamimi. I think she was famous because there's a picture of her when she was little. She was kind of like looking at this soldier. She slapped him or did something, and then she went to jail for it. Obviously, she's not a little girl anymore, but that's something that I remember.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the role of journalists and what it's like to be a journalist covering this conflict. There, from what I've seen, have been 11 journalists who have been killed so far in this conflict, I think almost entirely by Israeli forces. You've been covering this conflict as a journalist for years now, again, both in DC and out of Ramallah. What has your experience been like over the years as a journalist covering this? And then in this conflict in particular, I know it's only a week old, but what do you see as the role of journalists in telling this story?
So I think 11 Palestinian journalists have been killed, one Israeli and one Lebanese journalist. Overall, my coverage is that it's really intense. It's emotionally debilitating, especially when you're covering wars like the ones in Gaza, and anything that involves children is, I'm not, and again, this isn't to say that killing old people and adults is okay. I'm just saying, like, the pictures are just awful, and they really leave like a huge emotional toll on you. For me in particular, it has been a devastating kind of like 2 years in particular, because I had a friend who was a journalist who was killed. You probably heard her name, Shireen Abu Akleh. She was a Palestinian American journalist, and she was killed by an Israeli soldier. And that was really, and remains, very tough for me, because not only was she a good friend, she was a brilliant journalist. And just the way her killing was handled by the Israelis was really disgusting, to say the least. There was a lot of effort to kind of push the blame onto others when we all knew who she was killed by. I mean, we didn't know the person, but we knew it was someone from the Israeli army. And that has kind of changed my view on like practicing journalism in the West Bank. Like for me, I don't cover exactly the same things as I used to when I was younger. Like I don't cover as many, funerals or as many clashes on military installations. I don't do much of that stuff, especially because like I'm a mom now, and like I don't want to put myself in danger like that, for not, I mean, not just for my sake, but like for obviously for my kids' sake. But I just feel like journalism is like a hard subject to do. Like there's the physical aspect of it, but there's also the aspect of feeling you're constantly defending yourself, and like you're constantly defending an entire population, which is strange because you're a journalist and your job is to explain what's happening and to kind of, to also to obviously, fact check, to investigate, to do all these things. You're not just parroting what people say, but it just always constantly feels like there aren't things there are things that you can't say that others can't. You constantly have to humanize an entire population. You have to prove their worth. You have to prove their worth as humans. And it's hard to do your job like that. I mean, I feel particularly blessed in the fact that I've been doing this for so long, that I have editors, especially from the US, where I work predominantly, I mean, with media outlets in the US, and they know my work, they trust my work, and they trust me. But I don't think it's, this isn't just about me. I can't be the only one to carry the story, of what's happening in Israel and Palestine. So it's a little hard to, not a little hard, it's hard to get people, and by people I mean editors, to trust the words that are coming out of your mouth, because it's almost like you not only have to provide sources, but you constantly have to defend what you're saying, if that makes any sense.
Yes. What do you think happens next in this conflict? Where does it go from here?
Honestly, I mean, unfortunately, like the having the US in this situation like isn't making things easier, because all the Americans are doing is basically providing Israel with a carte blanche to do whatever they want. Like I said, to exact revenge on people who had probably had nothing to do with, not probably, who had nothing to do with what's going on, or what happened in Israel. And punishing an entire population is, for the lack of a better term, is a collective punishment, and that's what's happening in Gaza. So I think what's going to happen is that the Americans are going to continue to do this whole like we support Israel thing, and that's not going to go well for the Palestinians, I think, obviously. And the Israelis are just going to continue to punish and exact revenge. And I don't see how this ends, because the attack itself was so unprecedented that it was, it was almost shocking. I mean, it's not so much that it was people, I see people saying, oh, it was surprising. I mean, to me, it wasn't surprising. It was just like shocking and unprecedented. And I don't know where we go from here, honestly. Like, I've been doing this for so long, but I can't tell you what happens. All I can see is that maybe further down the line, like really further down the line, we see a ceasefire of some sort. I don't know when or how. I don't see how it could happen without US pressure. Usually Egypt plays a huge role in this situation, but even the Egyptians haven't been able to like, put pressure on Israel, obviously because of like the enormity of what happened in Israel, and the fact that it was so awful, like the killings and then the captives and whatnot. It's just like it's a different thing altogether, and I haven't seen something like this before, so I'm not exactly sure where we go here from here. But ultimately, I mean, obviously things are going to have to change. I don't know whether anybody will learn a lesson I don't know whether this horrible, time is a teachable moment. So I guess the short answer is I don't know.
Do you think Israel will be successful in its stated goal of destroying Hamas?
No. No, because you can't, first of all, like Hamas, we don't know. I mean, yes, there are people who belong to this faction, but like the sentiment that's carried is something that's carried like across like the population, which is that they're tired, they're fed up, they're poor, they're hungry, they're this, they're that. And maybe Hamas like, uses some of that to kind of shore up support for itself. But ultimately, you can't stop people from wanting to be free. You can't stop people from saying, like, I don't want to live this life anymore. And how they go about like carrying this out is determined by what's going on the ground. And so, yeah, you can take out, I don't know, 200 Hamas guys and their families and their kids and whatever, but other people will spring in their place, and I don't see how you can remove Hamas from this equation,
What do you want Americans who are listening to this to know about what's going on?
A part of me wants to say, like, I don't care if Americans know anything. It's not my job to teach people like that. Like, I feel like it comes when people ask you what's going on, that's you're in a place of privilege when you ask somebody like what's going on in the West Bank. Because to me, I think that people are smart enough and should care enough to know on their own and to learn as well. I guess the journalist in me would say, I urge people to kind of open their minds to learn more, to read a variety of things, not to believe everything, on WhatsApp that their mom sends them, or, not to believe everything that CNN tells them either. I don't know. Honestly, it's like such a difficult question because like I feel like I'm so tired and I don't want to teach anybody anything. And I just feel
I think
like when
that's a
you
fair
ask me that,
perspective.
yeah, not you, but like as a person, like when they ask me something like that, it's like such a white privilege thing because you're just sitting there and you're expecting like the information to come at you, whereas you're not making like much of an effort to kind of go out there and like learn on your own and whatnot. But I don't know if it makes a difference. Like I'm also American, I'm Palestinian American, and it pains me to see, so many people like, not knowing what's going on and making their own assumptions or following, a certain like line of thought. I would like to urge people to be more human, but I don't even know what that is anymore, honestly. Like, sorry, I know this is bleak, but I just don't know what else to say.
Final question for you, and this might be a hard one as well because it's pretty vague, but what does it mean to you to be Palestinian?
I don't think anyone's ever asked me that before. I'm not sure, to be honest with you. I To be Palestinian is tiring. It's like you're carrying like the weight of an entire nation on your back, and you feel like you constantly have to explain yourself, you constantly have to justify yourself. It can be a little too much sometimes. I wouldn't trade it for anything else. Even though like I'm also American, I still feel like I'm a fob, and so many things I don't understand. I mean, what is American football, right? But I think that, I feel privileged and honored to have been born Palestinian. And even though I'm technically like 3/4 Lebanese, which is just by blood, but like, this is what I identify with, and I identify with Palestinians. I feel like, a lot of people don't give them credit for being human, for being, I don't know, I feel like they're one of the few people who actually understand Israelis. I know that sounds insane, but if there's ever another person who will understand you, whether you're an Israeli or even an American Jew, or I mean, I won't speak for other Jews, or I won't speak for Jews at all, but I'm saying, what I'm trying to say is that we have a relationship, like we have this shared history, this link, you know, Palestinians and Jews, and I feel like people don't see that, and they don't see that, our fate is, I don't want to say we have the same fate, but we have a very similar fate. And the fact that we have to share this land means that we have to learn how to be with each other and talk to each other. And I know this sounds like, a conflict resolution class or whatever, but everywhere I've ever gone, the people who understand me the most, other than Palestinians, have been either Jews or Israelis. And I know that sounds insane, but at least you don't have to explain yourself to to an Israeli or a Jew, because especially Jews who have links to the Holy Land, they'll understand what you're talking about. And it's refreshing, and you don't have to sit there and explain yourself and say anything. And I feel like there's a shared path there, and I think we just have to find it somehow.
I think that's a really good note to end on. So, Dahlia, thank you so much for being able to do this. Where can people follow your work?
So I have my website, daliahatuqa.com, but I'm mostly on Twitter, even though I've been trying to run away from it. But I haven't found any other, I don't know, any other outlet, to be honest, where I can write or, share my thoughts or whatever. So Twitter/X it is.
Great. And we'll put your handle and your website in the show notes.
Sure.
Thank you again. I hope that you and your family are able to stay safe.
Thank you.